curious about your thoughts here. The big discussion, obviously, this week, which has kind of been the head of the news cycle here, is the play calling change. And I want to figure out where we should stand on it. We were talking about it some last week, but people are kind of comparing it to the Anthony Lynn thing, and obviously it's a little bit of a different situation, but I'm curious how you saw that change. Obviously it went well, but I'm curious your take on it here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting point for the Lions going forward. Again, the Anthony Lynn comparison is really accurate, but also there are some differences because back when that happened in 2021, Dan Campbell, his first year as an official head coach, he was still kind of learning the ins and outs about what he wanted from his team's identity. And I think at the end of the day, he soon found that Lynn wasn't really that guy. The difference this year with Morden is I think the organization still really likes him. And I think they like having his voice in the locker room, in the game plan study room. All of that, I think, points to him still being a big part of the offense going forward, even if he isn't calling the plays for the next week, for the next month, maybe for the year. He responded pretty well to it, and his mentality, I think, is top-notch for what you're looking for, because he was saying things like, I'll do whatever it takes to win. And he's not viewing it as a demotion or a firing. He's viewing it as the Lions are shaking something up to hopefully kickstart something better. And we saw that against the Washington Commanders. I think the offense looked as good as they had looked in probably a month. But the big question is this sustainable? Because looking at next week's game, it's going to be against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, they maybe haven't been at the top of their form, but it's the Philadelphia Eagles. They're a talented roster. They have a recent track record of success. That's not a team that's going to be easy to push over. So if the Lions perform well in that game, then I think you say, hey, Dan Campbell calling plays, good change. We progress with that going forward. If not, maybe you say, well, what are some of the changes we can do going forward that isn't necessarily how you're calling the plays, but the plays themselves to get your star players actually working in space and give them the best chance to succeed?
It seems to me a big part of this is Dan Campbell for a blocking tight end and a guy that doesn't necessarily have the reputation of being one of these football geniuses, although I think he should probably be starting to get that. He understands game flow really well, but I'm curious where you stand on this, Shayne, because you've had different coaches. We mentioned Belichick before the break. He famously liked to call a lot of the things, and once you got down to the coordinators, you didn't really know what they were doing on the team. Like, they were managing things, but they weren't necessarily the primary play callers. And then once they got to other teams, famously with the defense as head coaches, Romeo Crennel, or that we had Patricia here that moved here and then didn't really seem well prepared for. Big G's happy about the Patricia reference here, but he didn't really seem well prepared. But I'm curious where you stand on this, and if you saw a lot of differences between those different iterations of having an offensive coordinator call the plays versus one of your head coaches.
Well, I think it's really important to remember that just because the offensive coordinator may have the keys taken away on game day, they still drove the car all week long. They're the ones that designed the plays. They're the ones that came up with a lot of the scheme that they're using. Now, they may have done it in coordination with the head coach, but that offensive coordinator is the guy that was putting those plays together to fit the game plan. And when they're called individually during the game, may or may not be all that different because they're both looking at the same things. They're both seeing the coverages. They're both seeing weaknesses. They're both seeing certain things. But that head coach, that's why they have that coordinator, is so that they can build those things together, because some coordinators are going to be able to actually understand, okay, if we use these route concepts against, this defensive front or this, secondary, we're going to be able to take advantage of this or that. And the head coach is going to be on the same page with that, but they're also both understanding situational awarenesses and tendencies and things like that. It's just the head coach might have a little bit more freedom to kind of, let some things go that the coordinator may or may not, because they're thinking about, well, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to piss the head coach. Whatever thoughts may be happening, the head coach answers to himself. and he knows, like, I don't have anything to lose, so I'm going to call this play because I think this play is going to work. You just better get it off before that 15-second cutoff.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of the unabridged nature of if you're a head coach. Yeah, you don't really have to. I mean, as long Campbell's obviously not on the chopping block, he's not anywhere near it, so he's got a little bit of room to take that over, and nobody's really going to criticize him if he can't necessarily call plays in addition to his great management of the team and the culture. He'll just go back to that, and then hopefully Morton will learn from this too, because that was a point that was brought up last week that I think Jeremy Reisman brought it up, that when Ben Johnson was there, he got to learn under Campbell for a while, get his feel for how he would call a game. Now Morton can see that for however many games it is. I'm not sure how much this was happening when you were playing, Shayne. Are we making too much of the whole the sight, the eye line for the game being up in the box versus on the field?
You know, it's funny. A lot of coordinators have different opinions on that. You know, some guys like to see it from a bird's eye view. Some guys like to see it right there on the field. I think we can all be different in our preferences because I think when I think about certain things in my life that I've been good at or bad at, there's other people who are good or better or worse or however. But maybe those people that might have been better at it might have been better from a different perspective than the way I was looking at it. So I think we have to kind of, what's your comfort level? Some coaches like to see the macro. They like to see, you know, everybody all spread out over top of the field, see what the coverages looks like as a whole. Whereas some coaches like to see it kind of in that two-dimensional plane from the field level where they can see things play out and they might see details that they might not see up in the box, and that's where it plays in is instinctual decisions versus purely logistical decisions.
I do think that was an advantage of Campbell taking over, but still involving Morton because he was still up top and was probably filtering in comments and seeing that different view.
And they're in each other's headphones. I promise you, they're having a conversation, and that's honestly why sometimes there could be a little delay in playing that because maybe they're debating something. I mean, if you think of, I think about every field goal I ever kicked in my career that was beyond 50 yards. Almost always, you'll notice that we're sent out onto the field late because the coaches are like, "Should we go for it? Should we go for it? Kick it." And that conversation in the headset can sometimes create a delay in that. And then all of a sudden you got to spit it out to your quarterback through the speaker when there's a time limit on when you're allowed to put that out. That's when it plays into it.
That's so tight. It's amazing how quickly they can make those decisions. One of the key parts of Campbell taking over was maybe involving Jameson Williams a little bit more. And John, I got to give you credit on this because in September you were tweeting about, hey, we got to get J-Mo more involved and get him in these intermediate routes, and that's clearly what Campbell saw, and I feel like that changed the game a lot, and just getting J-Mo involved. This is a difference. We're going to talk about this a little bit with Glenn Irby when we have him on later of Eagles Wire, but I feel like Philadelphia and Detroit are kind of opposite in this sense. J-Mo has not kicked up any dust about not necessarily being involved quite as much, and A.J. Brown is always making trouble over there, and they're kind of going talent over culture, and Lions are going culture over talent, a mixture of both, of course, but that was clearly the key, and you were calling for that in September here, John.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the clash between the Eagles and Lions, and kind of coming back to the whole issue with John Morton is that even though he got demoted, his role got changed. There's no complaining. It's all about the team first, team first, team first. And we see a similar thing with the Lions offense. Like, look at guys like St. Brown and J-Mo. When they're not getting the ball, they're blocking their butts off, right? Guys like Jared Goff, like, this dude is an absolute trooper and one of the toughest SOBs out there. And you look at what this team is and the mentality that they built over the course of having Dan Campbell is that they're not a selfish team. They are going to do whatever it takes to win. And whether that's running vertical routes downfield and trying to air it out for J-Mo, whether that's fighting underneath, trying to get open in the slot, whether it's blocking for your running backs, whether it's a guy like Panay Sewell, who suffers what looks like a pretty bad injury, pops up a few plays later, and he's mowing down defensive tackles and cornerbacks as he's pulling. Like, these are guys who are so dedicated to the craft, and they're so dedicated to the guys around them, that I think it elevates them well beyond what their talent level may or may not be. Now, I think a guy like General Manager Brad Holmes has done an excellent job of cultivating that talent, but it's really just a perfect recipe of a coaching staff being able to get everyone to buy in to what they want to be.
It's a great point, and it's what you referenced it earlier, John, but it's what Morton's doing in this situation too. He's being a culture guy and saying, hey, I'm trying to do the best thing for the team. I'm still working, to Shayne's point. I'm still putting together things. I'm still working the other 6 days of the week. Just because I'm not calling plays doesn't mean I'm not involved, because that's one of the things we try to highlight on the show, that these are entire staffs. These aren't just 3 guys, a head coach and 2 coordinators. So it's a good conversation, but we'll return to it here after the break. Stick with us. You're listening to Extra Points on Jethro FM. Coming back here with John Whiticar of Pride of Detroit. I was looking at your article, John, about the winners and losers of last week, and obviously there was a lot of winners in that Washington game, but I want to highlight one of the losers, not to focus on the negative part, but I do think there's an injury component to this with Aleem McNeil, because he's struggling. He's one of my favorite players on the team. He's great for that pass rush and run defense alike, but we talk about this a lot on the show because we have Jimmy Liao on the show, and now with Shayne here, we're talking about the nuances of football and having to deal with injuries, because fans don't always like to hear it, but these are real things. And just, we were talking about kind of the minor things being able to throw you off. An injury is more than a minor thing that can throw you off. So I'm curious if that's what you're kind of seeing here with Aleem, John.
And whenever you come back from such a significant injury as what he had last year, it's going to take time to get reaccustomed to everything. I mean, this is a guy who missed training camp. And when you look at the offensive line, for example, that's where these very important bonds and chemistry are made. And all of a sudden, if a guy's out for most of that time, it hurts. And you see the same thing along the defensive line. Now, you don't think about a defensive line having cohesion like an offensive line, but how these guys interact with each other, guy like Hutchinson on the edge, how he can free up interior and other players. That's a big part of what makes a good defensive line successful. And I think right now for McNeil, I don't think he's lost a step. I still think you see those flashes of the prime McNeil we saw last year. But it's really just, I think it's going to take a few more weeks for him to get back into rhythm. I think in the run game, normally what is one of his strengths, I think he's been washed out maybe a few too many times, but he still has so much talent that I'm really not concerned at this point. The other nice thing is that the Lions are getting production from other guys on the roster. Obviously, a veteran like DJ Reader is great to have. I think we would all kind of agree we would like to see a bit more of Tyleik Williams out there, but they're also in a situation where they don't need to rush him either. Because then all of a sudden you have a guy like Roy Lopez, who last week Dan Campbell was gushing about. Now, this is a guy who is, I think, probably their second or third string nose tackle on the roster. How many times is an offensive head coach going to be gushing about a player like that? So it really makes you realize that, sure, I think McNeil hasn't really had the start to the season that we've looked for, but we also don't need him to be 100% right off the bat, because I think we have enough talent on the defensive line to facilitate him kind of slowly getting better and better and better. Now, that being said, I do want to see that in the next few weeks, but I'm not panicking just quite yet with his performance.
Especially because he's essentially going through his version of training camp, but into the fire. He's straight from the frying pan into the fire. I feel like you can relate to this well, Shayne, because we were talking about just the routine of the week to week getting screwed up. This is a guy that missed all of training camp. He was recovering from an injury, and now they're saying, okay, go push around 300-pound guards here, and don't show any history of your injury or anything that you're ailing or anything like that.
Well, one of the biggest things you have to build, whether you're injured or not, is confidence in your ability. And when you're injured, you don't get those repetitions. So it doesn't matter if a defensive lineman is, their main move is a bull rush, and their counter to that is a scissor move or a spin move or whatever their counter is to their main technique. if you don't have a chance to practice it in live reps, you're never really going to be that great at it, because you always have to. I mean, that was what Kobe Bryant was always like, the basics. I want to be so good at the basics that everything else falls into place. So when these guys miss that time, they've got to somewhat build it back, and you have some instincts, you have some, innate ability that you've always had, but you have to rep those things in order to have the confidence to do it the level that you're used to. And then you throw in, if you're not getting those reps when you come back, are they going to limit your reps to keep you from getting hurt more? And we can, I'm sure, talk about this at some point, but there's less contact now in practice than there used to be because the pad rules and the concussions and all that. And I think that's playing into the injury counts that we're seeing. Is less live repetitions of full contact means when you get in a game, you're seeing contact that you don't really get to see that much. And when you talk about a guy who's coming off an injury, he doesn't get any of that. And it's almost like go out into the fire and see how hot it is when you didn't get a chance to put your toe in the water during the week.
Yeah, he's the crab in the pot that doesn't know the water's boiling yet. Well, that's interesting. I do have that on our list to discuss at some point, not necessarily the show, although we can talk about it later in the show. But I was curious about the other side of this, because the Lions do have a lot of injuries, and they notoriously do practice very hard. Campbell has them going very hard. We see fights during OTAs and training camp and all of that, and mini camp, and they do go very hard. But that's curious to look at it the other way, to say, well, wait a minute, maybe that even though you are going hard, maybe it's that, well, you're not getting that as much, so then you're accelerating for those plays, which you're risking injury on those plays, and then you're also not necessarily getting those consistent reps to see how to read and react to all the things that can happen in a football game.
Yeah, well, the NFLPA actually puts limits on how much contact you're allowed to have and how many days you're allowed to wear full pads. And you can say we go hard in practice. I can promise you every head coach is going to say we go hard in practice, right? The way we do it here, like everyone's going to say that. And everyone wants to claim that they're that blue collar, hardworking team. But it's really hard when you compare it to just 15 years ago and 20 years ago, when it was full two-a-days and when you had, full padded practices for a certain amount of times. You just don't see that as much, no matter how hard the coach wants to go. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a limiting factor, but also are the guys, and that's what's probably what works well for Detroit. You talk about culture. You can have a winning culture, but winning cultures do not sustain. You can win, you're a flash in the pan. A successful culture is a culture that endures and that creates everyone wanting to be on the same bus, and you're all going the same direction, but also knowing where is my seat on that bus, and I'm going to sit in the right seat and know my role. And I think that's where you talk about the offensive coordinator kind of taking a little bit of a back seat. He knew his role, and during that week he still did everything within his role, and he's going to continue to do it. But the players themselves, they have to understand, if we're going harder than most teams, I want to buy in. So I'm believing and I have conviction in why I'm going harder in practice, because that's the culture we have here, and I have to buy into it, or else I'm going to be resentful every day when I lay my head down at night. And you'll never have a team that's truly successful if you have players that have that stench of the fester of resentment going around that locker room.
I feel like that's a perfect way to describe the upcoming matchup, because I've been trying to think about this. It's obviously two of the top NFC teams, but they're built very differently. You got the defending champions, and it's hard to say that that's a winning culture for sure. Though, like you're saying, Shayne, that's a team that's a defending champions, but they always seem a little bit like a house of cards to me, where their talent has to be so high to kind of overcome some of those things that you're talking about. Whereas the Lions, they've repurposed a lot of these guys. John, you mentioned Roy Lopez. There's a countless guys that you can kind of focus on where they're not going out and necessarily getting the Saquon Barkleys of the world. They're getting people that fit their culture. They're going after David Montgomery. They're doing those things. So I'm curious what you see, John, for this game, and what you see as kind of the keys to the game for the upcoming matchup with Philadelphia here.
Yeah, I think the key to the game is going to be the reason why they beat Washington last week, and I think it's going to be getting that run game going. The identity of this team for the past few years has been basically running it down the throat of the defense. And in the weeks before against Tampa and the Vikings, we weren't really seeing all that successful run game, and I think the Lions were in a bit of a tough spot. I think having to replace their interior, obviously losing Frank Ragnow was big. Bringing in a guy like Mahogany, who only had 2 career starts to his name, and then bringing in Ratledge from the draft, like there was a lot that could go wrong. And I think going into the season, they weren't really at that level yet. But what they showed against the Commanders, they were dominant, I would say, moving the blockers downfield, being able to get their guys space. And you know what happens when they're able to run the ball with Jahmyr Gibbs, with David Montgomery? It opens up everything downfield. That's when you have St. Brown working the interior. That's when JMO can take off either downfield, or guess what? They're introducing intermediate routes for him. And not to forget Sam Laporta. He's always a key part of the offense, whether he's a safety net or just a big playmaker. That's really the mentality for the Lions, is you need to be able to run the ball efficiently. And I think one of the key criticisms for John Morden when he was calling the plays is I think he wasn't facilitating a successful run game. I think there were a lot of very predictable plays, like running on 3rd and long or screens on 3rd and long, and it just wasn't cohesive. And I think now what we saw against the Commanders was the blocking up front looked very in sync. And if we can get a similar level of success against the Eagles, I think all of a sudden we're looking pretty good.
It's funny because we can see this as fans and people that cover the team, but I feel like Ben Johnson was even guilty of this, even though he had a very successful play calling career for the Lions and obviously earned his head coaching job with the Bears. I feel like he was guilty of this a little bit on the games that didn't go so well for him either. We know that the offensive line drives everything and then drives the running game, which that drives everything else. And it's just interesting to see, but I think just like he maybe needed the adjustment, I think Morton probably also needs that same adjustment. And like you said, John, they have a little bit of an embarrassment of riches. You got to Laporta at the end, and then you didn't even mention, one of the guys, because he is later than all those other guys that you named, but you got a guy like Khalif Raymond who can get involved, and he's keeping the local talent Isaac Tesla off the field because Isaac's going to be used in a different format and he's still learning the offense. So that's the other part of this, is you are still trying to get everybody involved, even though they're not demanding the ball. You still want to try to have the reps be somewhat even and try to feed everybody as much as you can.
Yeah, exactly. And I think probably one of the reasons why the Lions were struggling for a bit on offense is that it wasn't just the right call at the right time. And it's kind of like playing rock, paper, scissors. You can win with every single hand, but you're not going to win all the time if you call the same thing. And I think with Morden, one of the reasons why him stepping back and maybe handing the reins over to Dan Campbell can help is that you're not focused on making the right play call at the right time. Instead, you serve up a platter of great plays to Campbell and let him kind of cherry pick what works and what doesn't. And sometimes it's really just about the feel for the game flow. As we mentioned earlier, Dan Campbell, I think he has a really underappreciated understanding of how a game is going. And I think when he was hired, a lot of people kind of viewed him as a bit of a meathead coach, more of a personality hire, rah-rah guy. But he's really a smart cookie. I think he really does not get enough credit for his game planning. And I think when you're able to get someone like him mixed in with a veteran like Morden, even regardless of who's calling the plays, I think if they can figure out what plays are the best at the right opportunity against the Eagles, that's how you capitalize it. Because we've seen very successful screenplays, but we've also seen them blown up in the worst possible ways. And sometimes it's just about throwing the right hand at the right time. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Lions really looked outclassed against the Vikings the other week, is that Brian Flores just pitched a masterclass.
We've talked a lot about kind of the smarts of Dan Campbell on the show, because I want to talk about this more with Shayne later, but it's like we make everybody one thing. He can't be big and tough and a blocking tight end and also smart. You can't be more than, everybody's more than one thing, but it's like we have to understand it better in our own brains, and so then we don't necessarily expand the possibilities. But great stuff, John, as usual. Appreciate you joining the show. Make sure to tell people where they can find you, and also highlight the Movember campaign for us too.
Yeah, so I currently write for Pride of Detroit. We are a branch under SB Nation that covers the Detroit Lions. We're posting articles every day. We got a few guys in the locker room getting quotes and other comments from players, coaches, and whatnot. But yeah, November is a very important month for us. It's when we are doing our Movember charity campaign. So for reference, we've been doing this for, I believe, 5 years now. And it is raising money for the University of Michigan Health Rogill Cancer Center. And a lot of people throughout the entire world have been impacted by cancer. For example, Jeremy lost his father a few years back. I've had an uncle who's been suffering from cancer for the past probably 4 or 5 years. And all the money that's being raised for this goes towards that kind of men's charity for Cancer Research Fund. So we have a few incentives. We have a few auctions. We have giveaway prizes coming up. Some of our incentives, if we hit my personal favorite of $75,000 raised, is Jeremy Reisman, our editing manager. He will shave his head, and he is deathly afraid of that because he's not sure it will come back. So hopefully we can make his day a little bit worse by making the day a bit better for all these charities out there. Yeah, you can find more information on the Pride of Detroit homepage. We got a link posted at the very top, and we'd appreciate any sort of donation. Hopefully we can do our best to raise money for a very, very unfortunate situation for a lot of people out there.